So we've looked at many different types in TypeScript. There's a couple more that I'm going to be looking at a little bit later in the course. But at this point, I want to dive into functions. So functions are pretty much the same way that they are in JavaScript with a few additions that you get from TypeScript. So for example, if I want to define a function, so let's say I'm going to define a function that's going to add two numbers. I'm going to say add, and I'm going to say A and B. So those are going to be numbers. And then I'm gonna just add them together. So we're gonna have the return statement here, and then I'm gonna say A plus B, and that's our function. And you can already see that I'm getting an error from TypeScript because the parameters in the function, they have type any. So what we need to do is to pass in the type of the parameters. So for example, I'm gonna say this is gonna be a number, and the B is also going to be a number. So I'm gonna say number. And just to test this, so if we do console.log, and then we pass in add, and let's say we pass in 5 and then 9, and then we're gonna go ahead and run that. You can see that we get 14. So functions are pretty much the same way that they are in JavaScript, with a few features that are added by TypeScript, such as type. And also functions now have return type. So for example, if I hover over the add, you can see that the return type is a number. So TypeScript was able to infer that by looking at what I'm returning here. So for example, if I'm returning like a simple string here, for example, now if I put my mouse over it, you can see that it infers that this function returns a string. And you can also explicitly say what the function is returning. For example, I can say this function is going to return a number. So now if I try to return a string, for example, then it's going to give me an error because the types don't match, because this function is now returning a number, but at the bottom at the return statement, I'm returning a string. And you can also define arrow functions. So let's say I'm going to define multiply, and let's say we're going to accept two parameters. So I'm going to say A, which is also going to be a number, and then B, also going to be a number. And let's say this is going to be A multiplied by B. So you can have a statement like this as well. And if we try to log this out, and let's just call multiply and go ahead and run this, you can see that we get the 45 at the bottom. So you can have arrow function, and you can also have regular function with the function keyword, and that would work just fine. And one thing to notice about this multiply function is the way that I'm returning these values or this statement. So if I hover over it, you can see that it's returning a number. But really, I could do something like this. I can come here and I say, okay, this is gonna return a number. And then instead of doing this, which is a more elegant way you can do this when you have only one statement, I can do open and close curly braces, and then I can say return and then pass it in here. So this is really the long version of what we just did, but just so you get the picture, I just wanted to, give you the long version of this so that you can understand what this is doing. So if I hover on it again, you can see that it's still returning a number, and now it looks more like a regular function that you know. But when you have it this way, it's just a little bit more elegant when you have it just like that. But you can only do that when you have a statement like this. If you're gonna have multiple lines inside of the function, then you can't really use this notation. If it's gonna be one line or one statement that you can have on one line, then you can just have it like this and it would work just fine. And if you wanna explicitly specify the type, then you can come here and you just say, okay, this is gonna return a number, and that works just fine. Another thing you can do with function is you can give them default parameters or optional parameters. So let's say, for example, I have a function and let's call it format name, for example, right? And we're gonna take a first name, and that's gonna be a string, and then the last name, and that's also gonna be a string. And let me make some more room. So this is gonna return a string. So I'm gonna say string, open and close curly braces, and close this a little more. So we have this function that we call format name. It takes a first name and it also takes a last name, and it returns a string. So it's gonna format the name and then return it. So we can say something like return, and then we can do first name and then a space and then last name. So we can format the name like this, and then we return it as a string. Now, if I wanna call this function, so let's say format name, I have to give it both parameters. So I have to say, okay, so this is the first name and then this is the last name. So let's say, for example, Smith, right? So we're gonna call the function like this. And let's also go ahead and console log that as well, so we can see something in the console. And I'm gonna go ahead and run it now. You can see that we have the name, right? So the name is returned from the function. But another thing we can do is we can make this last name, for example, optional. And the way we do this is just passing a question mark after the name. So we're gonna put the name, and then before we put the type, we put a question mark, and that makes this parameter optional, which means I don't have to pass this parameter and TypeScript is not gonna complain. So now if I remove the last name, for example, so if I remove Smith, you can see that the function is not complaining, everything still works. And I can go ahead and run it again. Then we get undefined for the last name because we didn't pass the last name. So this is optional parameter. And of course, you would probably have a logic inside of this function where you check to see if you get this parameter. If you didn't, then you can format the name a different name so that you don't have anything like undefined in your return statement like this. But I'm just showing you an example. So another thing we can do is we can have default parameters. So we can come down here, and let's say now we're gonna say, well, let's name this 2, right? So format name 2, and I see that this is going off the screen, so I'm gonna remove the return statement because TypeScript is gonna infer it anyway. So you can see that TypeScript is inferring that this is returning a string. So what we can do here is, instead of making this optional, we can actually give it a default. So we can set it to some string, for example. So we can say unknown, right? So let's say we're gonna say the last name is unknown if they didn't pass the last name. Now I'm gonna go ahead and call this function down there. So if I call this function with just junior, and this is supposed to be format name 2, so we're gonna console log whatever this is gonna return. So what it's gonna return is it's gonna pass in the first name because it gets the first name because we passed in the first name, and then for the last name, it's gonna see that we didn't pass a last name or the second parameter, so it's gonna use this default, which is unknown, right? So it's gonna be unknown. So let's go ahead and run this, and you can see that we have junior unknown. But if we actually pass in a last name, right? So let's say Smith, and then run it again, you're gonna see that it replaces the unknown with the actual parameter that we passed. Now, one thing you have to know about this is that your default parameter, it has to come last. It cannot come before any other parameter in the list of parameters in the function. So you can't put it in the beginning here. So if I try to do that, I can show you an example. If I set this equal to some string, and let me make some more room, and now I'm gonna say, okay, this is gonna be of type string, right? So let's say I want this to be passed in, and let me make sure I spell this right. And you can see that we still don't have any errors, right? Because we're passing in the 2 values that this function is somewhat expecting, right? So if I run it now, it's gonna be Junior Smith, right? Because that's what we're passing in, and you can see it down there. But for example, if I say, all right, well, I don't know what the first parameter is because I'm giving it a default, but I want to pass in the second one. So I'm gonna say, okay, I'm not passing in the first one. So if I remove this, you can see that we get an error. You can see if I hover it, it's gonna be confused because it doesn't know for which argument we're passing in this value. So that's why you have to make your default parameter comes last, because then the program is gonna be confused. You can see here, it doesn't understand that we're passing this in for the last one. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. But for optional, you can pass in optional for the first or the second or the third. It doesn't really matter with optional, but with the default, it has to be the last one. So I'm gonna Control Z so that I can undo all of that. All right, so now it's not complaining anymore, and I can go ahead and pass in one parameter here, and it's just gonna print undefined for whatever I didn't pass if I didn't set it for anything, or it's just gonna pass in the default. In this case, it's unknown, and you can see it right here. There's also another concept of rest parameters. So let me quickly show you an example. So I'm gonna scroll down, and I'm gonna create another function. So let's say function, and I'm gonna call it print names, for example, right? And I'm gonna say it's gonna take a first name, and that's gonna be a string, and then I want to take everything else that the user passed to me. So I can just spread them and then pass it in as a parameter. And TypeScript call this rest parameters. So I can do ... and then I can do all the rest, right? And then let's just say this is gonna be an array of strings. So I can do string array, and then we're gonna say this is gonna return, the first name. So we're gonna say first name, and then we're gonna add in all the other name, all the rest, and then we can just use any of the methods that you can use with array as long as it's gonna return a string. So for example, I can just join everything, and then let's just passing in a space here. So I'm gonna say space. So we're gonna take everything else, we then space them out, and then we're gonna return them as a long string. So now what I can do is I can go down there, and then I can say console.log, and then let's say I'm gonna call print names, and then I'm gonna say, all right, so my first name is Junior, right? And let's say my middle name is let's say John, and let's say I also have my mom's name or family name, I don't know, Smith, and I can keep going because this is an array. So I can say, I don't know, Joseph, right? And all of this I'm passing in to the same function because this takes an array for all the rest of the parameters, which is why this is called rest parameters. And I can keep going and going and going. So now if I go ahead and run this and move this over here, you can see that now we have Junior, John, Smith, Joseph. So it takes everything else, join them by a space. And we can also put a space in between these two. So for it to do this, I can just come here and then add another plus sign here, and then add another space in here. So this is going to be the first name, space, and then all the rest, which we're joining, and then we're passing in a space in between each element in this array. And I can keep adding, I can add one more here. So I can say Raymond, right? And that will work as well. So make sure you guys can see all of this. Okay, so we're calling the same function and we're passing in a number of parameters to it. And we can keep going. So let's go ahead and run it again. And you can see that we get this long string printed out and we have absolutely no problem. So this is called rest parameters. One last thing I want to teach you about function is function overloading. Now, if you're coming from a Java background, you're probably familiar with this term already because it's used in Java. So function overloading in Java, at least, is having a function with the same name in the same file, but then the parameters are different. And we have something similar in TypeScript. So say I have a function and I'm gonna call it add values, right? So let's say it's gonna take two values. So val, and that's a number, and it's gonna take another one, val2. So let's call this val1, and val2 is also gonna be a number. And we want to say this is gonna return a number, right? So we're gonna define it like this. And then I can have another function, so function, and I'm gonna call it add values again. And it's gonna take two values. So let's say val1, and this time this is gonna be a string, and it's also gonna take a val2, and this time it's gonna be another string, right? So we're gonna take two string, and this is actually gonna return a string. So we can have the functions defined like this. And then what we can do is we can say, all right, so for this function, add values, it's gonna take two parameters. So let's say A, and let's say I'm gonna give this a type of any, and then B, and give this a type of any. And what I can do is I can just say this is gonna return A plus B. So I can do that. And you can see now I don't have any errors because I have an implementation for these two functions and they're returning different things. So if I go down here, I say add values, and then I pass in 5, and then I pass in 8, for example. And let's make sure we can see this. So I'm gonna console log that and close, and go ahead and duplicate this line. And here I'm gonna pass in, let's say I'm gonna pass in a name, for example. So I'm gonna say Junior, and let's say Kevin, right? And this is supposed to be add values, not add. All right. So now you can see that I don't have any errors and I'm calling two different functions and they're returning two different things. So if I go ahead and run this now, you're gonna see we got 13 for this addition, and then we got the concatenation here, as you can see here. And we can go ahead and fix this so that we can put a space in here. We can add the space inside of here. And if I go ahead and run it again, now we get a better output. So we have 13, and then we have Junior Kevin. So you can see that we can have function overloading in TypeScript as well. So you can have different functions with the same name, but different parameter types and return types.